Thanks, Ann. A few months ago, one of the original founders of the Arkansas Society of Freethinker dropped us a line and said, "Hey, I would like to donate my personal library." I said, okay, what do you mean by personal library? And as we got into the dialogue and went and looked and found out, it was a really amazing assembly of books that if you ever read them all, you would have like a PhD in being a free thinker. It includes books on religion, includes religious criticism, includes history, mythicism, really drawing the lines between historical myths and the beliefs that are common today, and going back to a lot of original materials. And you should always go back to original materials when you want to know what a particular thinker from the past thought, because the retelling of the story always has some editorial license in it. One of the books I checked out from the new ASF library that we built with help from one of our members who donated some space in an industrial building that he manages. We went and we actually built out the library in January, put walls and ceiling in, got climate control, and now we have access to this library and some storage space. And one of the books I checked out that I want to talk to you today about is the writings of Sextus Empiricus, which is among the only writings that we have about the skeptical school of philosophy in ancient Greece. Now, we all have this colloquial idea of what it means, what skepticism means, what it means to be a skeptic. The dictionary says a doubting or questioning attitude or state of mind. The French playwright Molière had a play called The Forced Marriage, in which a skeptic named Marfurius is being hit with a stick, and while he's starting to yell from being hit with the stick, the person hitting him with the stick tells him that a skeptic cannot be sure that he's being hit by a stick or not. The French philosopher and essayist Anglin in 1932 wrote that there is one true skeptic, and he insists that nothing is true, and he insists upon it dogmatically. And so the general idea is that if you question too much, you must become passive or intellectually helpless and unable to acquire any truths. But again, this is the story told by the non-skeptics about the skeptics. When you go back to the source materials, the actual skepticism was a pushback against the extraordinary claims of the Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, and Epicurean schools of philosophy. I mean, Aristotle believed that there were four elements: earth, water, air, and fire, and that comprised everything on earth, and that there was a fifth element that existed in the cosmos and the stars, and that the fifth element, the stars, had souls that told them where to move in the sky. And so, and the Stoics were often citing mythology to explain why things were as just sort of a, I'm going to stop explaining at this point sort of thing. And so the skeptics, meanwhile, were just refuting, and this was thousands of years ago. Pyrrho, Sextus Empiricus, and the others, they had a practical criteria. They weren't just we-know-nothing kind of people. They applied the common laws and customs of the day, the guidance of nature, the compulsion of feelings, the tradition and laws and customs, and the instruction in the art. And their goal, like a lot of the other philosophies of life that came out during that time, had a lot to do with contentment and being unperturbed so that you can be rational. And so that they share with the Epicureans, the Stoics, and others. But their point of view was that one key reason we get perturbed is because of what we think we know, because we believe things that aren't justified. And that resonates to me when I was reading Sextus Empiricus, because how many people do we know today who are tying themselves in knots, trying to figure out how to live in accordance with some reality that they have constructed in their own heads? How many people are really perturbed and living a really disturbed life, and they can't get out of that rut because of what they believe? Skepticism has several modes to debunk claims of knowledge. For example, Sextus, who was a physician, noted that animals have different sensory organs than humans do and likely perceive the world in different ways. He couldn't have known back then that some animals only see in black and white, some have a whole different color spectrum, different hearing. Science would later prove that, but he was already on that path going down that road from observation and saying that, how do we know the reality we perceive is the true essence of things, like a lot of these philosophers were claiming and building these elaborate, intellectual constructions on top of. On God, Sextus Empiricus said, some of the dogmatists, and that's their general term for anyone who's not a skeptic, some of the dogmatists assert that God is corporeal, while others say he is incorporeal. And some say he has human form, while others deny it. And some say he exists in a place, while others say he does not. And of those who assert his existence in a place, some place him within the world and others outside it. How then shall we be able to form a conception of God when neither his substance, nor his form, nor his whereabouts is agreed upon? And he goes on to talk about the problems with anthropomorphizing God, like if God can speak, does God have a throat? And if God has a throat, can you choke it? Things like that. And he asks questions like, why does God only speak in Greek, according to the Greeks, not any of the other languages in the world that they were already aware of? So thousands of years ago, you got the stuff in the original source document that people in the last 10 years have had, blockbuster books repeating the same ideas. So, And if you've ever heard of the empirical school of philosophy, Locke, Hume, this is the source material that they were rebuilding a skeptical movement from, and that's the basis of the philosophy of science. Science starts, back in these original materials. If you would like to take a journey like I took, dig into something like this is just the first thing I happened to grab, mostly because it fell out of the bookshelf and hit the floor, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. I'll just check that one out as my first thing. But if you're interested in checking out a book, email us at info@arfreethinkers.org, and one of the board members will help you get into the library and take a look around. It might save you a fortune building your own personal library, because you'll be able to review the things that you'd like to buy yourself, or maybe you just dig into the ASF library and see what you can find that really changes your worldview. Thank you very much, and I've gone a long time, probably overshadowed the main speaker. Talk to you later.
Thank you, Chris. At each meeting, we invite a local freethinker to tell a story about themselves. Today, Todd Billings, the founder of the Arkansas Society of Freethinkers, will share a story.
Well, hello. I was going to actually just tell, the kind of cliche origin story that a lot of people tell in these things, but I've done that relatively recently in the fall, and we were having small attendance back then, and it'd been picking up lately, so I thought, there'll be a lot of people that hadn't heard it this time, so I'll just retell it. Well, I get here today, and apparently that trend did not keep up, because now I'm seeing that, about 80% of you heard my original origin story. So I was like, okay, well, what am I going to tell instead? So basically, and also since this will be briefer than talking about what led me away from the fundamentalist religion I was bred into, is just talk a little bit about what inspired me to start this organization in the first place. This is not something I planned, though, and I have bad ADHD, so if it sounds disjointed and unplanned, that's because it absolutely is. Anyway, when I gave up religion, I suddenly found that it was kind of lonely. So my first attack, given that I know the Bible very well, was to try to convert people, basically to deconvert people. And I found out that real quick that for a lot of believers, it's not about logic. I mean, sure, some people, once I showed them, the various contradictions in the Bible or with theology in general, would come around. But the majority of them, I've had some that wouldn't even look at the Bible. I'd be like, well, here, look at this. No, my faith is so great, I don't even have to look at it. No, I'm serious. It's right here, your own Bible. No, man, I know that it doesn't say what you're saying. God's telling me it does not say that. The biggest lesson was my own mother, because when I first gave up religion, she was like on me, to try to bring me back in. And whenever she'd pick at me, I would naturally do these same things, point out contradictions and stuff. And one day she was going to surgery, and my mom has an anesthesia phobia. She always thinks she's going to die every single time under anesthesia. And the doctor said, "Hey man, your mom wants you to come in here." And I came in there and she goes, "Look, the stuff you've been talking about, it's starting to make sense to me. So I've got to please ask you to never speak of it again. I promise I will not push it on you if you don't say anything about it." Now, she did not keep that promise. But anyway, so, man, I realized then that, it's not enough to just convince people that they're wrong. You got to replace it with something. And so that planted a seed of wanting to form an organization. Although the final catalyst came when I was a substitute teacher. I was probably this is 1996, so I'm 24. And a teacher had hung specifically biblical Bible verses all over her wall. And I complained to the administration of the school, nothing happened. Complained to the superintendent of the school district, nothing happened. And I thought, well, you know what? I bet if there was an organization that had a threat of a lawsuit behind them, they would do something. So I went to the Secretary of State's office, and apparently you needed 2 people to start it. My best friend at the time was out of state. So I got my beloved Christian dad, of all things. My dad's the opposite of my mom in many ways. He actually, a Christian, helped fund this organization, very uncomfortably. He came to the Secretary of State's office. He's like, "Boy, you better get Lee Wood to come here and sign this and put my name off of this as soon as possible." But we are all here today because my dear Christian father loved his son more than his religion and was willing to co-sign on this organization. At the beginning, it was also kind of dangerous because me and Lee were pretty cocky. I put my own home address and phone number on all the materials we distributed. And when I say distributed, I mean I would leave them in doctors' offices, public libraries, without anybody's consent. So it wasn't exactly like I was this innocent person. But we had our cars vandalized, death threats. Someone had removed all the 4 nuts that held my drive shaft into where they were all hanging by a thread. Literally had the dedication to get up under there and do that in the middle of the night. On another occasion, someone did the same to the lug nuts on my car, unscrewed them to where they were hanging by threads. So when I started to go driving, it was doing this little number here. So anyway, fortunately that's died down. As far as I know, we haven't had any problems like that. But that's why this organization exists, and I'm so pleased to see that it's here, almost 30 years old. It's 27 years old now, and I'm glad to see my baby grew up, and it hasn't been my baby in 20 years. But anyway, that's all I got to say. So.
Thank you so much, Todd, for everything. If you'd like to share your story, or even a part of it, at one of our future meetings, please let us know. You can talk to us if you'd like to deliver the free thought of the day, the skeptic sidebar, or a member story. If you have something to share, we want to hear from you. The Arkansas Society of Freethinkers is a diverse organization with members who represent a wide range of opinions. We invite speakers who we think will be interesting and make us think. Today, you may have been expecting Lisa Childers to talk about the state of education in Arkansas, but she managed to catch COVID last week, so her presentation has been postponed until next month. Not to fret, though, because Professor John Anglin is here to expand our minds about the faking of the moon landing. We are extremely grateful that he could speak to us on such short notice. John has an impressive resume and can speak authoritatively about the faked moon landing. He was a flight engineer for the U.S. Air Force for 20 years with over 100 combat missions under his belt. He was awarded 2 air medals for his efforts. Aside from his military chops, though, he has degrees in astrophysics, applied science, and education. He's an adjunct professor at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock in physics, and an instructor at the Arkansas Governor's School. More to the point, though, he has taken a deep dive into the realm of what is possible by diligently studying space operas, including the universes of Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, Babylon 5, and Dune, from which he has gleaned considerable expertise, not just as to today's topic, but in all matters concerning space travel. And speaking of travel, I have it on good authority that he's one of the people who actually escaped from Alcatraz. Please welcome John Anglin.
Thanks, Ann. So, yeah, I know I'm not Lisa, and I actually did escape from Alcatraz. You can Google me. If you Google my name, that's the first thing that comes up. There was a guy, John Anglin, and his brother Clarence, who probably escaped from Alcatraz. Made a really good movie about it in the 60s. I was traveling in the Air Force once and went through San Francisco and tried to get on the tour to go to Alcatraz Island. And they told us that the ferry was full to go out there. So I pulled out my ID and I said, I got off this son of a bitch once, I will get back on it. Yeah, my topic is not about education, although I have spent a long time teaching and I have a lot of opinions of my own on those, so if you would like to discuss those as well, we can do that. But what I want to talk about today is this kind of idea that's arisen in the last, I don't know, probably 30 years. It's really gained a lot of traction, that we never went to the moon in 1969 through 1972. This comes up a lot in my physics classes. I actually use a lot of these arguments in my physics classes to get my students to kind of think a little more deeply rather than just accept the word of somebody who's an authority. Now, as Ann said, I do have a whole lot of knowledge in this area. I've been thinking about this kind of thing and studying this kind of thing my entire life. I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, where we built the Saturn V that took us to the moon. My uncle worked directly for Wernher von Braun. My grandfather built the wind tunnel models that we tested the design of Saturn V at Marshall Space Flight Center. My dad just retired from Marshall Space Flight Center about 10 years ago. He was the configuration manager on things like Hubble Space Telescope, Chandra X-ray Observatory, and some of the modules in ISS. His last assignment was being the configuration manager for Artemis 1 that just launched last December. Now, I tell my students this, and then I say, did you know that the moon landing really was fake? And my students, now these are either gifted and talented high school students or college, predominantly freshmen and sophomores. And they don't know how to react because they view me as an authority, right? They took that idea that, oh wow, the guy grew up in Huntsville. He must know something, right? What does the accident of my birth have to do with my knowledge of anything? And so I kind of walk them through some of these ideas, some of these conspiracy theories ideas, and I make them give me the answers. I make them think about this. I don't have enough time to really dig into the way I would do this in a class, so what I want to do is just kind of walk through a couple of the arguments. Have the next slide up. So is there evidence for this? I've just picked 4 kind of broad topics that you'll hear the conspiracy theorists talk about. They'll talk about, oh, it was CGI. Oh, no, it was shot on a soundstage. Stanley Kubrick argument. It just looks fake. I mean, look at the limb. I mean, this thing couldn't possibly fly. This is something somebody built in their backyard. You also sometimes hear, well, the math doesn't work. Mathematically, it's not possible. So let's get into the first topic, which is the CGI. So I found a couple of images here that I think are pretty interesting. The one in the top left, this is an actual image from the Apollo 11 flight in 1969. This is the lunar excursion module returning from the lunar surface. It's taken by Mike Collins, who stayed in orbit with the command module. And I want you to take a close look at that image. Look at the interplay of light and shadow. look at the definition of the curvature of the lunar surface. The moon is small enough that at this distance, you can kind of see some little imperfections with kind of the mountains and things like that. Also notice the direction of light. You have the Earthrise in the back there, and notice that the top of the Earth there is illuminated, which would also be the top of the lunar surface. So everything lines up there, nice and neat. You've got some dark areas from Sea of Tranquility down there that has to do with the composition of the lunar surface. If you take a look at the image on the right, what I've got there is an actual picture on the right of that of Buzz Aldrin coming down the ladder of the limb. And on the left is a completely computer-generated image. It was done in 2014, and it was done using the Unreal Engine. If you know anything about video games, first-person shooter kind of things, the Unreal Engine is one of the industry standards. Now again, this is probably 10 years ago, but that looks pretty convincing until you look closer. So if you look, you'll notice if I didn't tell you that was a computer image and the one on the right is an actual image, at first glance, you might say, wow, that's real. But if you examine the computer-generated image a little more closely, you'll start to notice that the textures are a little kind of plasticky and smooth. You don't get the kind of fuzzy definition, gradient definition of shadow. Shadows in the computer-generated image tend to be much, much sharper and much more high contrast. They don't tend to be as transparent as an actual shadow. So the point is that while that is a convincing computer-generated image, it still cannot come close to mimicking the reality and the detail of an actual image. Now, one that I found particularly interesting, in the bottom left here, what we're going to do is we're going to play a short video. I think this is about a minute and a half. This is actually one of the very first examples of actual computer-generated animation. It was done in Russia in 1968. So this is prior to the moon landing. So this was the absolute height of what we could do with computer imaging at the time. This is not a flip book. This actually is on a computer monitor. But what they've done here, you can see as they dissolve that this is kind of just a series of ones and zeros. This is what we used to call ASCII art back in the 60s and 70s. And so what they've done is they programmed each of those ones and zeros by hand, by coordinate, to make the cat. And then they move it just a little bit, and they take another image and move it just very much like stop motion today, and you compile it. I could not find a lot of data as far as how much processing power and time this would have taken. Knowing what we know about computer animation now, knowing what we know about the state of computing in 1968, particularly in Soviet Russia, my guess is that that probably took every bit of computing power they had, and it probably took weeks to render. So the next time somebody says, wow, it was computer graphics, computer-generated imagery was how we faked the moon landing, I disagree. I don't think that anybody had the technology at the time. Even if you want to say that it was a new thing, like I said, this kind of conspiracy theory started about 30 years ago when it really started gaining traction. Again, look at my Unreal Engine. That was 10 years ago. So think about the state of computer animation and graphics 30 years ago. There's no way. It would be cheaper to just do it. Which in fact leads me to the next topic of the soundstage. So a lot of people will say, well, it was Stanley Kubrick. Stanley Kubrick directed this thing. Stanley Kubrick actually had won the Oscar for Best Visual Effects for 2001 in 1968. It was a huge technological achievement at the time. It was as revolutionary as Star Wars in 1977. And so, of course, he was big in the news, he was a big name. Using effects and computers and things like that in film were a hot topic in society. And so, of course, Stanley Kubrick would be the man, right? He would be the one you'd want. Today, perhaps you would get Michael Bay, but you'd have more explosions. Or, you know, Clint Eastwood, perhaps. But I want you to take a look. Also, probably one of the best pieces of science fiction ever. If you don't know about Doctor Who and you haven't watched it, you're failing in life. So this is an episode called The Moon Base. This is a miniature that somebody built in a garage somewhere at the BBC and filmed it with a VHS video camera at the time. You can look at it and tell it's a model, right? I almost put a subtitle on this slide from Mike Python and the Holy Grail. It's only a model. So clearly that's a model. Well, you might say, okay, but NASA and Stanley Kubrick, they had much, much better technology than what Hollywood's doing. They were just hiding it from us, right? And they were using just the best stuff. Well, a year later, in 1969, the film that won the Academy Award for Best Visual Effects was a film called Marooned. And it was actually based on a book that had been written some 50 years prior. It was updated for the film to be about Apollo astronauts. And so they used models that they, I think, actually had some cooperation from NASA to get a hold of models to film these things, and didn't look anywhere close to that. Well, what if it wasn't Hollywood? Let's find some actual NASA footage of a soundstage. That's what the top right image is. This is an actual NASA image on an actual soundstage with actual astronauts using flight hardware to train how to use the equipment. I think they're training on some kind of geology equipment here on how to dig for lunar samples and things. Again, the trick that gives it away here, look at the lighting. Look how the lighting works. The soundstage is incredibly bright. The shadows just don't quite look right. Well, they look exactly right, right? As opposed to the Doctor Who image. In the bottom left, this is actually Apollo 12. So Apollo 12, you have the astronaut raising the American flag. This again is one of those conspiracy theories. Oh, the flag moves. It must be waving in the wind. No, it's waving in the inertia. An interesting thing to look at with this image, though, and this is a conspiracy theory you hear a lot. If you look in the training image up there, you'll notice that the shadows tend to be in different directions. That's because there are multiple lighting sources. They're having to light this from the front and from the sides, so they can get all their archival footage. Well, the conspiracy theorists will say, well, that can't happen on the moon because the only source of light is the sun. So if you take a look at the Apollo 12 image, you can see that the shadow of the astronaut that's taking the picture, the shadow of the flag, and the other astronaut are relatively parallel. But look at the shadow to the left. That's not parallel. That's got a little bit of an angle to it. So that implies there's a second light source. But if the only light source on the moon is the sun, then clearly this was done on a soundstage, right? That's only partially true. There is another light source on the moon. The moon. Why do you think you can see the moon at night? The surface of the moon is highly, highly reflective. It's one of the greatest magnitude objects in the sky. If the thing is that highly reflective that we can see it from Earth at night when the sun is on the other side of it, do you think that's going to create a little bit of light interference when you take a picture when you're standing on it? Of course. This is also why there's no stars in the background. Try to take a picture of the night sky with your iPhone. Not going to happen. You need the exposure time, right? Because that's a very, very weak light source. If you were to take an exposure on the moon where you could see the stars, that's all you would see. You would see a sea of white and then some pinpricks of stars on the black, and you would get nothing out of it. So, I submit to you that the soundstage argument, probably not the best argument, right? Well, let's take a look at what we did build, right? It just looks fake, right? Look at this thing. I could build that in my backyard. Well, okay. And maybe let's examine that and say, that doesn't really look sexy. That doesn't look like a spaceship. That thing would fall apart if you tried to fly it. Yeah, on Earth. But guess what? The lunar surface, it's not the Earth. In fact, this is one of the things that I tell my students all the time. Unfortunately, we must do physics experiments in the confines of our laboratory and in the confines of inconveniences like air and gravity. The Earth is a really terrible physics laboratory. Just that idea, that concept, that what we observe in our day-to-day lives, what we observe in our physics labs, are tainted by our environment. And we have to get rid of those external variables to get the truth. This is a vehicle that was built to operate in a totally alien environment. Now, if you'll notice, it has what looks like copper and gold wrapped around it. That's actually not copper and gold, it's just plastic. There are several layers of what we call beta cloth in there. It's, I don't know, probably 3 inches thick. It's an insulator. So the trick is on the moon, since there is no air, you don't have convective cooling. The only cooling you have is radiative, meaning that, for example, if you took a pot and put it on the stove and heated it up, the air around it might be perfectly fine, but if you touch that, it's going to be hot. And the heat's going to radiate, right? Well, because we only have radiative cooling, we don't have convective cooling, we can't rely on the air to take away heat. So what we have to do is to build this thing in such a way that it's highly, highly insulated. This is effectively just a giant thermos that we put the astronauts in. The gold color comes from a layer of plastic. I can't remember what the chemical name of the plastic is because I'm a physicist. It's coated and manufactured in a way that blocks UV light because UV will cause things to degrade. And so that's what gives it the kind of gold color. It looks sort of wrinkled and crumpled by design because, again, we're dealing with a totally alien, hostile environment. There's no air to scatter the light. So any radiation you get from the sun, any direct heating radiation, is going to be directly against and directly reflected away. So that's going to cause hot spots. So by creating this interesting geometry, this random kind of wrinkled pattern, you diffuse that radiation a bit. It helps cool the spacecraft. And I put here this image, this schematic is of the LEM. This is actually from a NASA training manual that I have that details some of the engineering schematics. And you can see that underneath the skin of this thing, this is a very, very complex machine. This is a highly, highly engineered thing. It's very compact, right? Everything has a purpose. And you might say, well, if you're going to insulate things, cool. Maybe you insulate where your instrumentation is, obviously where your astronauts are. Why insulate the landing legs? I mean, that seems silly, right? Who cares if they get heated or cooled? Well, what happens to material as it gets heated or cooled? It's going to change its geometry, right? It's going to expand, it's going to contract. This thing had to work. You got one shot. What happens if the landing legs don't extend? You're in trouble. So we have to insulate everything to keep everything at a reasonably uniform temperature. And again, because of the interesting physics of thermodynamics in a vacuum, that's why you have this. So yeah, it looks ugly. I think it's beautiful. I think it is a fascinating piece of engineering. But your average guy, especially somebody that's primed to want to believe that this was fake, would easily look at this and go, I can make that. I just sit that on a soundstage. Well, I mean, we've already talked about how it can't be a soundstage and it can't be CG. That's an actual image that they took. I think that was on 11 as well. But very impressive. But of course, and this is the last one I want to talk about because I think it's probably the most effective. Because what I've done so far is I've kind of showed you some images, and you're kind of having to take my word for it as an authority figure. But let's look at some mathematics. So I'm going to show another video here. Now this video is a little difficult to see, so let me prime you on what you're going to look at here. These are astronauts on, I think it's 14. They're unloading something from an equipment bay. And as they unload from the equipment bay, there's a cargo strap that comes loose. Now you can see it, if you look, there's kind of a dark spot in the center of the white there. And you can see it occasionally swing in and out of frame, okay? So this is a pendulum. Now pendulums are very, very interesting things. The interesting thing about a pendulum is that its period of oscillation, right, the time that it takes to go one full oscillation, is only dependent on two things. It is only dependent on the length of the cable and the acceleration due to gravity that it's under. It has nothing to do with the mass. Well, as I said before, this is a highly, highly engineered vehicle. So we know down to 3 decimal places what the length of that cargo strap is. Also notice that it's doing something kind of weird, and in the next piece that I'm going to show you, there's a better diagram of this. Go ahead and go to that link, actually. I didn't feel like writing an entire slide about this mathematical proof, so I just found a web link for it. There we go. I think if you just hit maximize on that. Or not. So I've got a mathematical proof here. Here we go. This is actually a NASA document. You can find this pretty easily if you go look it up. If you want to scroll down that document a little bit. So right here is a period of data. This is NASA engineers and physicists like me, and what they're doing is they're examining that pendulum behavior. And you can see where they've derived the acceleration due to gravity here. I can't quite discern those numbers, so I can't read them to you, but you can read them for yourself. And you'll see, there we go. So what you'll see is, oh, that's nice, yeah. So what you see here is the time of the pendulum, and you see the period. So you see you're getting a period on this thing of about 4.5 seconds, thereabouts. So if you scroll down a little bit more, keep going. This is just a scatter plot of those periods. Notice that it has 2 periods that we're looking at. There's a red set and a blue set. If you keep scrolling down, there's an explanation for what this is. That's the equation for a pendulum, by the way. So if you keep coming, there we go, that's what I'm looking for. So we have what's called a mode 2 pendulum here, where point A is the attachment point of this cargo strap. L1 is the length of the entire cargo strap. There's some kind of buckle or mass or something on the end of it. And as it swings inwards, it connects another part of this bay, And so only the bottom part of the pendulum oscillates, so that's your L2. So if you'll scroll down those a little bit more. So we talk about our lengths, and right there is what I want. So we have a physics equation that if you were in my class and we were studying pendulums, I would make you derive this on a test. But since it's not a physics class, I'm not going to be that mean to you, and I'm not going to ask you to derive it. So what we find as we calculate the pendulum here, we calculate the period. So you have period 1. That's your period of oscillation for the whole system, your merit, point A. And then you have your period 2, which is that shorter piece. So if you'll scroll down here a little bit, and we apply this offset, again, this is something that I would have my students derive. But if you keep scrolling down, they eventually will come to a point where we're going to put some numbers into this. A lot of this is heavy physics and mathematics. And there we go. And so what we'll find is there's your average time to complete one period. And if you scroll down a little bit more, we'll find the averages. And keep scrolling down, and we're going to find where, keep going, we'll find where we can plug this in eventually. Again, this is very detailed, and I didn't want to go through the whole thing. Keep going down, and eventually we're going to get to a point. Oh, okay, that's the end of it. It's somewhere in there. I saw it, and I can't remember exactly where. But somewhere in here where we actually go and we plug numbers in. And because, if you go back up to the top of this document, the first time it gives you the equation for a pendulum, down a little bit more, right there. Notice that the period is this 2 pi root L over G, where L is the length of the pendulum, G is the acceleration due to gravity. Well, again, because we know how to do dual mode pendulums and we can come up with an equation for period, we observe the period, right? Just with a stopwatch. That was easy from the video. We observe the period. We know from the engineering diagrams what the length is. We can't do anything about 2. We can't do anything about pi. Those are constants. The square root is a constant operator. So the only unknown that we have here is G. So if you do this on Earth with this setup, what you're going to get is a G that works out to be about 9.8 meters per second squared. If you do this on the moon, if you're actually in a lunar environment, then you come up with an expression for G that's about 1/6 of 9.8. And again, as you dig through the data in this thing, you find out that's exactly what happened. So you might say, well, okay, but what if they just slowed down the footage? Well, if they did, wouldn't everybody else in that footage be slow? Wouldn't everything else be sped up? So clearly that's not happening. So you might say, well, okay, what if we're on the International Space Station? What if we're on a 707 doing a parabolic flight? Pendulums won't do this. They won't pendulum in a microgravity environment like that. When you're on the ISS, when you're in an orbit, you're in a constant free fall. Imagine that I had a pendulum and I released it and it's oscillating, and then I drop it. What's going to happen? It's not going to fall and oscillate at the same time. The whole system is in free fall. So if you were on the ISS and tried to set up a pendulum, it wouldn't pendulum. It would just hang there wherever you place it. So that can't be it. So this is absolute mathematical proof using something that's not extremely complex, right? This is not a very, very difficult equation. It's a little difficult to derive, but it's not a difficult equation to use and understand, and we can see definitively, beyond just my insistence of how cameras work and how the lunar environment works, well, now you can prove it yourself. And there's one more thing you can do to prove that we really went to the moon. If you go to an observatory that happens to have high-powered laser, we left retroreflectors on the moon. They're just mirrors. And we know exactly where they are. And since we happen to know the speed of light, and we happen to know the distance to the moon, we can shine a laser on a mirror, get it to bounce back, and read the time that it takes, and know exactly what the distance to the moon is. And if the mirror wasn't there, you would get refractive scattering, and you'd never get a good signal back. So how is that possible if it's a soundstage or CGI? It's not. The next time somebody tells you that we faked the moon landing, do this. There are two things that I respond to that with. Number one, which one? We did it 6 times. Which one did we fake? And number two, you believe in the moon? That's crazy. So I think that's enough about the craziness there. And I think we have a little bit of time. If you guys want to ask questions about physics and design and things like that, I can do that for you.
If you have a question, raise your hand and I will bring the microphone to you.
Would it also be true that since this was also an extension of the Cold War time and control of space and the military advantage that would convey, that there's no way in hell that Russia would have set back
No.
and not scream to the world, no,
Of course.
they did not launch anything.
Of course.
Nothing went into space.
Of course.
They're lying to you. Instead, did they not congratulate us?
They did, while we were in orbit. Let me expound on that thought a little bit, because that's a great point. Consider the political environment of the time. This is the Cold War. This is about beating the Russians, right? We're better than them at all things, everywhere, all the time. If, let's say for a moment that we wanted to fake this, ask yourself what the consequences of getting caught are. In the height of the Cold War, had we been faking this, and we failed just a little bit, and we got caught, you're right, the Russians, absolutely, look, they faked it, right? We have no credibility. There's no funding, right? Funding is what makes this happen. So yeah, good point. That yes, the Russians absolutely would have been going, yeah, this is stupid. And the damage that would have been done had we faked it is too great. The risk is far too great. Plus it was expensive. Like I said earlier, it's cheaper and easier to just go to the moon than it is to fake the moon landing. All right, what else?
I'd like to come back to the question about education.
Uh-huh.
As it stands in these days, I mean, I'm old, I was educated a long time ago.
Uh-huh.
How do you find the current class or the current level, your students, how do you find them? Are they fully engaged? Are they really smart? Are we in good hands or are we hopeless? Are we without hope? Because
It depends on the student. I have noticed recently, especially as we're coming off of COVID, and we spent a good 2 years just making our students sit at home and look at a computer screen. Personally, I think that was a terrible idea. I think that was one of the dumbest things we did. But as a result of not teaching teachers how to deal with that, and a result of not holding students accountable, that's been a problem anyway, I'm seeing students that are a good 2 years behind in academic and social development. The ones that care are fine. They're finding they have to work a little bit harder, but that's okay. I tell my students all the time, I want you to be wrong in my classroom. And that's not so I can point and laugh at you, because I'm going to do that anyway. I want you to be wrong because that's how we do science. So if the ones that embrace that, the ones that try, I got no problem with. I am, though, seeing an increase in students who feel like a college diploma is something that you buy. They feel like, I'm here, because that's what they've been trained the last couple of years in high school. I'm here. I checked the box. I made an appearance on this Zoom call, and the teachers aren't allowed to fail them. because somebody might get their feelings hurt if they get a bad grade, and they come into my classroom and they think that's going to fly, and it don't. I do not think that all hope is lost. I do think that as educators, we have a hard hill to climb. And it is incumbent on all educators, I think, from kindergarten on through, to double down a little bit and demand a little bit of academic accountability again, which I think is something we've lost. And I don't think COVID was the only reason for it, but I do think that accelerated it. But yeah, if we get back to some academic accountability, it's not too late to fix it.
Any other questions?
Do you think the new program, Artemis, is going to go well and long? What happened with Apollo is we beat the Russians,
Mhm.
and a lot of politicians decided
Yep.
that's all they wanted to
Yep.
do. So do you think science is going to be enough to keep Artemis going for a while?
You know, that's a difficult question. I think Artemis has a good chance of being a long period program. Artemis actually is designed with the idea of going on to Mars. Beyond that, it's a test bed, but of course Apollo was as well. I think the difference here is the introduction of private spaceflight companies like SpaceX and whatnot. There's an interesting dynamic there. You've got guys like Elon Musk out at SpaceX. I know he's not politically popular with a lot of people, but let's take that out of the equation. You've got a guy like Elon Musk, right? He's kind of a weird eccentric dude. I'm kind of a weird eccentric dude. But he's interested in this. He likes the idea of exploration of space travel. He's willing to take the risk. He's not doing it for the political gain, right? He may be doing it for monetary gain, but he's got investors, right? He's willing to put the money in. He's willing to make the risk. NASA, on the other hand, has the funding, because they get funded through the government. You know, the government just prints money if they want to, as long as they want to fund it. But I think with this partnership, if we find the right solution, if you find the right combination of these private companies as well as NASA, you do some partnerships and you kind of share that burden a little bit, I think it has a little bit longer legs than Apollo. I think what's going to make that more of a reality is once we can finally get a manned mission, once we can finally land on the lunar surface. Artemis 2 will probably fly next fall, and that's going to be a manned orbital, but we're not going to land. And sometime, I think in 25 or 26 is the projected date for Artemis 3, which will be our first landing. I think that's when you're going to see it take off. I think that's going to reignite a desire for exploration in the public and in Congress. China is trying to do a manned lunar program right now. They've got their own space station. And if you hear politicians talk right now, China is the big boogeyman. So we may end up with another little small space race. So yeah, I think that's a valid point. I think that the political piece of that and kind of wanting to beat somebody, it helps. But I think with the partnership of private industry like that is gonna help drive some of that too.
Elon Musk,
Yeah.
how is this going to enter into the equation, and is that going to speed up things, slow down things, or how is that going to affect things?
Right now, there's actually an interesting argument going on with that right now. NASA awarded SpaceX a contract for the lunar landing vehicle, and it's supposed to be based on Starship, which is the big thing that he's trying to launch that had a rapid unscheduled demolition a month or two ago. That's part of what we do, though. It's part of what we test. Because of that setback, NASA has also awarded a contract to, I think it's Blue Origin, to do an alternate design. And so I think the thing that's going to be the road bump right now is that independent contractor coming up with a good design and getting flight reviews done and getting it flight ready. But overall, I think it could speed the process up. Again, like I said, you've got private companies like SpaceX that are more interested in the science than the politics. And as a result, they tend to have a little less bureaucratic red tape to get through that NASA intentionally has because government operation. So I think if you can use those private companies to bypass a little of that, at least in the design phase, then perhaps that helps speed things up.
Professor, thank you.
Of course.
Appreciate you being here today, especially. We hope you enjoyed today's meeting. Next month, we hope we will host Lisa Childers, who will tell us about her experience as a high school English teacher in Arkansas this year. In March, Lisa was featured in a Washington Post article about teaching during the frenzy of book bans. The Arkansas Society of Freethinkers needs volunteers. We need people to help with graphic design and website development, to write letters to stop church-state violations, and to host activities and events like potlucks, a book club, and family and child-centered activities. If you have skills or ideas to contribute to our cause, contact us at info@arfreethinkers.org. Get involved and come to some of our other events. Our calendar's at meetup.com. Thank you for coming. We hope to see you here next month.
Like to know more about the Arkansas Society of Freethinkers? Check us out online at arfreethinkers.org. You can also find us on Meetup, Facebook, and on YouTube. At Arkansas Society of Freethinkers, people are accepted as human beings and are never threatened with eternal damnation. In a nutshell, a freethinker believes there are no imaginary gods whose dogma is sent to control the human race. Rather, we are all human beings responsible for our own actions and our own future. Check us out at any of the following online locations. Send us an email and let's talk. Or go to Meetup and join us at any of our regularly scheduled events. Let's get together and hope to see you soon.